The curved Greatsword weapon class is very comparable to the Greatsword weapon class in that their speeds, damage, and movesets are somewhat similar. Now, for the most part, I think that regular Greatswords tend to outclass curved Greatswords, and as of the DLC, potentially even Great Katanas could outclass them too. But specifically for the regular Greatswords, they can just get a bit more damage, a slight bit faster moveset, especially now with a recent patch because they actually benefited off the heavy attack changes where the curved Greatswords did not, and also that is get better variety in their moveset as they do get things for poking attacks, which also extends to their weapon skill options. But a couple things that they do have going for them is that they tend to get a bit more range than the regular Greatswords, and they also do slashing damage. But also in that instance, the Great Katanas can just do that as well, and also just get bleed on top of that. But there are plenty of really good curved Greatswords in this game, as I will cover on this list. But for me personally, it is actually kind of hard to pick one of the infusable curved Greatswords over things like some of the infusable regular Greatswords or Great Katana. I wish they had like a slightly unique moveset, specifically unique power stancing combo, and maybe their own unique type of skill. That would have been nice. But anyway, for today, we are going to rank all 11 of them from worst to best based on how well they perform in PvE. You guys should just get the idea by now. Let's just get started. Starting off at the bottom, the Monk's Flameblade and Infusable Curved Greatsword, and this one is just the worst one in the entire game because it gets the worst damage and some of the worst range with like the exact same moveset as most of the other curved Greatswords. So essentially there's like no reason to use this one over any other curved Greatsword. The only thing that it probably has going for it is that it is the lightest of the Infusable Greatswords, but it's only by 1 unit. So you're better off just going with the Dismounter as it has the exact same moveset, just more range and more damage, and you can acquire it earlier in the game, and it's a lot easier to acquire as well. Just to get it to drop, it's off like just one random enemy at the end of the game. I don't know why this thing wasn't a unique type weapon with a unique skill or had like passive bleed, because it looks like it should be getting passive bleed. But yeah, there's like nothing unique about this at all. Number 10, the ONYX Lord's Greatsword. Now this is a curved Greatsword that just gets average range, average damage, cannot be infused, actually does get a pretty decent strength and intelligence based scaling. It actually does scale a bit better off strength, but the thing is, if you're just going to go compare it to the ones that can be infused with a strength type of build, those are just going to perform better. And even if you actually use those things with a magic infusion, they're still going to be better. Now obviously with infusions, you only really get 1 good scaling, where this weapon gets 2 good scalings, but even at these really high levels at 80 strength and 80 intelligence, it still doesn't really get much more damage than the other options. But the main reason I wouldn't really care to use it is because its skill is not that good either. ONYX's Lord's Repulsion is just like a reskinned version of Gravitas, which this skill is like a small AoE, not that quick, not that good at damage. There are so many other different types of AoE skills in the game that it is much better than this one. Now the differences between ONYX's Lord Repulsion and Gravitas is that this one actually does get a bunch more damage, but it's a lot slower, consumes like twice as much FP, and it literally does less stance damage as well. Like if you want a weapon similar to this, just use the Alabaster's Lord Sword, because the skill of this one just goes way further, and it's like a lot cheaper for similar damage. There's so many different types of gravity skills in the game, and half of them just work the exact same way. I would have liked for this one to get like a slightly different type of skill. Number 9, the Dismounter. Now this is not a bad weapon by any means, hence it's still getting into the B tier. And in fact, before the DLC, I actually valued it a lot more, because before the DLC, it was the only curved Greatsword that could be infused, that has like the regular curved Greatsword moveset, and it actually just gets this much range. Even though things like the Omen Cleaver could just outdamage it, I just prefer the Dismounter more because it actually does get the better heavy attacks in my opinion, as those things just cover much more range for basically the exact same speed. But since the DLC releasing, I think the FREYJA'S Greatsword just outclasses it. It gets very similar range, gets the exact same moveset, but it just gets way more damage. With every single infusion, the FREYJA'S Greatsword just straight up out damages it, and it also just gets the benefit of just boosting your red main types of skills. Now that's still not to say that the Dismounter is useless by any means, because if you still wanted to use a weapon like this, you could just use the Dismounter for the first part of the game because you acquire it like right at the beginning, whereas the FREYJA'S Greatsword is obviously in the DLC, and the Dismounter obviously is a lot lighter and just gets lower requirements. So I still think it's pretty solid for an early game option, but almost every other infusable curved Greatsword is just going to outdamage this one. Number 8, the Omen Cleaver, which is a strength-based infusable curved greatsword. Have this thing elemental infused, it actually gets some of the highest damage. Now, one thing that I don't really like about the Omen Cleaver at all, and the main reason why it's going to get a bit lower on the list, is going to be its heavy attack. Now, this charged heavy attack does do a little bit more damage than all of the other charged heavy attacks, but that does have such bad range that like almost every single time that I use it, I just end up missing because the animations of these curved greatsword heavy attacks are not that quick at all. And the annoying thing is that this also extends to the jumping attack too. It just also gets this really bad range. So for me, I'll just gladly sacrifice that little bit extra damage just to be able to have a heavy attack and a jumping heavy attack that just gets more range. But it still is a perfectly fine option that you can get pretty early in the game. Number 7, the BEASTMAN'S Cleaver, which is a strength-based infusable curved greatsword. It actually does outdamage all the other curved greatswords that can be infused with basically every single infusion. Even dexterity infusions, the BEASTMAN'S Cleaver just gets the highest too. Now, there are going to be a few different downsides that the BEASTMAN'S Cleaver does have. One, Actually, it's some of the worst range in class. It ties for the highest amount of requirements, and it also is the heaviest as well. It weighs 16.5 units, which there's like colossal swords in this game that just weigh less than this. It definitely is very heavy for how much range this thing has. But the reason why this thing is very heavy is because this weapon is actually very good at blocking. It gets the best guard boost and guarded damage negation out of all the curved greatswords by a considerable margin, which this is actually very useful, especially in the DLC because of deflecting types of builds. So it can be a very nice option to pair alongside that. Now, unfortunately, for curved greatswords, they don't really get the best guard counters. They only get 33 stance damage with a guard counter, and the speeds aren't really that fast either. Things like regular greatswords are going to do more damage, do more stance damage, and basically be the exact same speeds for a guard countering attack. And even those ones aren't really that good either. But the fact that it is blocking is obviously going to be a benefit still. So yeah, it does actually have a whole bunch of positive things going for it. But I think the range is going to be the biggest turnoff for me, because I know I can just get the FREYJA'S greatsword, and that's just going to have much more range with the exact same moveset, be a bit lighter, and just get very similar damage. But if you did want to incorporate deflecting builds, then I think the BEASTMAN'S cleaver is going to be your main option. Number 6, the Horned Warrior's Greatsword, which is a faith and strength based curved greatsword. Now it actually does scale a lot better off that strength stat, so going all into strength is going to benefit you the most. And unfortunately, the total overall damage is not that good. Going into these pure strength builds, basically every single infusable curved greatsword is going to outdamage this, even without buffs. And when speccing into a lot of faith, it still doesn't really make that much of a difference either. I kind of wish this weapon got some split holy damage as well, just like another extra 100 or 200 holy damage just thrown onto the top of it. It would have made a lot more sense, and this did like a lot more damage to be in line with some of the other curved greatswords. But I think the best part about the weapon, and the reason why it's going to get into the A tier, is because of its skill, Horn Calling Storm. Now, it is very similar to Stormcaller, as it does serve as like an AoE attack that surrounds the player, and all enemies inside of it can just get stun locked. Now the thing is, Stormcaller can like stun lock these smaller enemies better because it does spin faster, so they are just going to get trapped in it for a long time, and it can result in higher damage because obviously you can pair Stormcaller alongside weapons that just get more damage. But Horn Calling Storm does have a couple of benefits. The major one being is that it goes really far. Like, it's like 3 times as much range as regular Stormcaller. So if you're surrounded in a room full of enemies, this can be one of the best skills to use. And another reason why it can be better than Stormcaller is that you only get stuck in a 2-swing animation. With regular Stormcaller, when you use it the first time, you have to swing 3 times and you can't cancel it. So it is a result in like a much longer animation that's very easy to punish, where Horn Calling Storm is only just 2 swings. So using it against enemies or bosses that can't normally be staggered by this attack is going to be a lot less risky. Now, I still wouldn't really bother using it in those boss fights because it does lack a lot of damage, but when you're fighting these smaller enemies, this thing can just straight up cheese all of them. So I would like to put it into the S tier, but it just lacks a lot of damage in my opinion. Number 5, the ZAMOR Curve Sword, which is such a disappointing weapon because it has an S tier skill, like one of the best skills in the entire game, but the weapon itself is just awful. It's a strength and dexterity based curved greatsword that cannot be infused, does scale best off that dexterity stat, but when compared to all the other curved greatswords, those are just gonna get more damage with these quality builds or dexterity infusion. It also gets the worst range out of all the curved greatswords by a wide margin, and it also gets the worst moveset too. Those light attacks are horrendous. They're awful. They do a bunch of these stupid spinning attacks, which one, are very hard to aim and actually land. The hit detection is just terrible. They don't lunge very far, and they're so slow. These movesets are so much slower than the regular curved greatsword light attack combos. You literally get faster heavy attacks than you actually do with the light attacks. It's just stupid. So honestly, the weapon itself is like a fat D tier, even an F tier weapon that sucks, but the skill is its lone saving grace, ZAMOR Ice Storm. For only 15 FP, you summon this Ice Storm that procs Frost so incredibly fast. It does like over 300 Frost build-up in only a couple of seconds. It also does 40 stance damage, and it also does hits for a whole bunch of magic damage too. Like, just using this skill the entire time and not even using the weapon is obviously going to be the optimal option, and it's just going to destroy all enemies in the game. It's going to stun lock, proc stance breaks, proc Frost faster than almost anything else, and just do amazing damage in an AoE. Now, the only downside of this skill is going to be that the weapon actually doesn't get an intelligence scaling, so there's actually no stat that actually boosts the damage of this thing. It's only based on the weapon level itself. That's the only way to actually improve the damage, is just by upgrading the weapon. It would have been nice if this thing actually got a descaling in intelligence and some split magic damage, just so we can have a way to just improve the damage and actually benefit off using some magic types of buffs, because the weapon itself only gets physical damage. I think the major use of this weapon is just to be used as a secondary option, being that it has low requirements, it doesn't really weigh that much. You could just use it at the start of the boss fight to just proc Frost, or even just proc a stance break, and you could just like switch back to your main weapons. But yeah, in terms of using it as a primary option with its light attacks and all, I don't like it that much. Number 4, the FREYJA'S Greatsword, which is one of the new curved greatswords from the DLC. And this one actually can be infused and actually gets some of the highest damage in class. In fact, with almost every single infusion, it just like gets the second highest damage, just right behind the BEASTMAN'S cleaver. But actually, I'm going to prefer it more than the BEASTMAN'S cleaver because one, the damage difference is not that great, but the range difference is. This thing can actually just hit at a much further distance. It also weighs a bit less and also gets the passive effect of just boosting red main types of skills, which does include things like Lion's Claw and Flame of the Red Mains. Now, it is only going to be by 10%, so if you actually did want to go with a Lion's Claw type of build, you're obviously going to be better off using the Colossal Sword, but it actually does have the benefits of being an offhand option. As long as you have the weapon equipped, you're just going to benefit off that 10% more damage. But for a weapon that weighs 14 units, it's probably not going to be that useful. So I think that like, the best use of this weapon, if you were to use the Flame of the Red Main skill, being that the skill of this weapon doesn't actually scale with AR, it doesn't really matter what weapon that you actually pair it with. So the FREYJA'S Greatsword is just the best option and best pairing for a skill like this. And the skill itself is actually pretty decent. Obviously nowhere near as good as it used to be, but it still goes very far, does decent damage in a nice AoE. So for me personally, I do consider it to be the best infusible curved greatsword, but that's only in certain situations. If you cared more about deflecting or if you didn't care about range, then the BEASTMAN'S cleaver is the better option. If you wanted to go with like an elemental build and use a curved greatsword, then the OMEN cleaver is the better option. And for early levels and early game, I just use the dismounter. Number 3, the MAGMA Worm SCALESWORD, which is one of the best strength and faith-based weapons in the entire game, which is definitely saying a lot because this particular build type is just stacked with amazing options. And the fact that it does synergize with this build means you actually can pair it alongside the Clawmark seal and benefit of a lot of really good spell damage. But the reason why I value this weapon a lot is because it does get really good scalings and really good damage. Getting a B scaling of both faith and strength is amazing, so it's just a heavy hitting curved greatsword. Now unfortunately, it does get like the OMEN cleaver heavy attack, which is that short range downward chop that I don't really like. It does get a bit more damage than the other charged heavy attacks, but the range is so bad to the point where I rarely ever use it. But thankfully, the skill does more than enough to actually make up for it, because Magma Guillotine just hits like an absolute truck, become airborne, crash to the ground in this massive AoE magma explosion. And as of the DLC, using things like the Talisman of the Dread is just going to further enhance this skill by 15% more damage, which is kind of just crazy because even before the DLC, this thing was doing immense damage. Now for an additional 10 FP, you also get a follow-up attack, and for some reason, this follow-up attack just does more damage than like the initial slamming attack, and the entire combo can just melt so many enemies in the game. Now the unfortunate part about this follow-up attack is that it doesn't really get good range, and you are on the ground, so it's easier to get staggered compared to the airborne version that typically gets like infinite hyper armor. So I think that's the main reason why it's not going to get a bit higher on the list at number 2 or number 1, because I think the skill is a bit harder to use. It also is one of the heaviest curved greatswords too, but in terms of its overall damage, its scalings, and its skill potential, it definitely is deserving of an S tier. Number 2, the MORGOTT'S Cursed Sword. Now this is an infusible curved greatsword, and by no means is this actually the hardest hitting one in the game. In fact, it actually gets some of the lowest in terms of damage, as weapon only really does get a dexterity scaling and a pretty poor arcane scaling. It kind of felt like this weapon was supposed to get some split fire damage, but it only really got physical damage when hitting with the weapon directly. But those are basically like the only downsides that I can say about this weapon, because this curved greatsword is the longest curved greatsword in the game, and it also is the lightest, which is just ridiculous. Like being the longest and the lightest is like unheard of. But yeah, it also does retain the really good curved greatsword moveset, and it just gets passive bleed too. And thankfully, it actually does get at least somewhat of an arcane scaling, so going into the arcane stat is going to benefit of just more bleed buildup. But even after all that, the best part about the weapon, once again, is going to be the skill Cursed Blood Slice. This skill lunges towards the enemy very quickly, closes in the gap, actually does a really nice swiping attack that covers a wide radius, has some good tracking, does good damage, has a little bit of a blood flame AoE aftershock, and you also get an additional swiping attack too. And this entire combo can just do some nice damage, some very good bleed buildup, and also do 28 stance damage. Now the entire combo does consume 40 FP, which is on the higher end, but for how easy it is to use and how much you do benefit, I definitely think it's worth using. And also, if you manage to get a stance break by spamming the skill, you're also just going to benefit off a riposte, because this thing does get 110 crit multiplier too. So although I do wish this thing had a bit better of an arcane scaling and some split fire damage, it has way too many upsides for it not to be an S tier. And at number 1, the Bloodhound's Fang. I'm sure to nobody's surprise, I've talked about this weapon plenty of times, so I'm not going to go into too much detail again, but it is one of the best weapons in the game that you can acquire right at the beginning. This thing gets some of the most damage with a really good strength and dexterity scaling, gets really good range, gets the regular curved greatsword moveset. It is a weapon that cannot be infused, but it can be buffed, and it gets passive bleed, so you can just throw on Blood Flame Blade onto this thing and its benefit of amazing bleed buildup, amazing damage, and a really good skill, because Bloodhound Finesse is incredibly cheap, high damaging, does come with an iframe dodge in the middle of the combo, also do some really good stance damage. Like, you're going to spam this skill over and over again, and in most cases, you're probably just going to benefit. And also another benefit I forgot to mention, it also just gets bonus damage on jumping attacks too, which jumping attacks are a very like noob friendly way of just doing some high damage and high stance damage. I feel like this whole weapon was like designed designed to just help out newer players that were struggling with the game. Like, you can just pick this thing up and just use it in any which way and you're just going to benefit. Now, the only downsides that I could say about the Bloodhound's Fang is that it only gets a strength and dexterity scaling. So if you actually wanted to pair it alongside spells, you're not going to be able to. And it also doesn't get like a projectile skill. And I think projectiles just cheese the entire game, as I always mentioned, because it means that you don't even have to engage with an enemy. So yeah, I think that's like its major downside, is its lack of synergy. But this weapon is still definitively one of the better ones in the entire game. Anyway, that is the list now done and completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. As for the next video, I am going to cover the katanas. Once again, that's going to go down in order of which the game recognizes all the categories. So yeah, the katanas are going to be up next. Do let me know if you actually wanted me to incorporate the great katanas with the regular katanas in that video or not. But yeah, that will be the next one. So definitely do subscribe for that. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.